Well, g'day. How's it going? This is Iron Horse here, and I've got a day off. How about that, eh? The weather's been a bit stink lately, and second day in a row now. Leave home soon after 5 a.m. and get to work, and it's still raining, and got sent home. So, thank you for watching my cooking show the other day. I was having a bit of a laugh as I do, and I'm actually somewhat sober. I know it's like. There's something wrong with Iron Horse. Oh, that's it, he's sober. So here's something I prepared earlier, as you do. This is one I tried to prove my point the other day and I realised that I'd drank them all already. So this is this lovely, most recent brew that's just a little over 3 weeks in the bottle, nearly 4. As you can see, it's a lovely, clear, rosy colour. In fact, this one gives no head at all. The last one had some. That's a bit disappointing. Still tastes nice. It's got a little subtle fizz. If you look real close, you can see the bubbles. Maybe. Where's the camera? Over there. Nah, it's not going to focus. But there are bubbles in it. It's almost like a lightly carbonated grape juice made from beer. Cheers. Anyway, what I've decided to do is to just make a series of short videos explaining some very basic things about the flat earth, because it's occurred to me that well, there's hundreds and thousands and millions of people who now understand we live on a stationary planar earth. We haven't really made any new leaps and bounds for some time now in some of the simple basic things that we should have a fairly good understanding of by now, you would like to think. Like, I've been a long time fan of the Globe Busters, and rest in peace Bob Nodal, you were one of the greatest. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, you made that channel, you were that channel, and the other guys, they're all great, they're great contributors, they're great members, sidekicks of the channel, and it's a great shame that we have lost you and lost the guidance that that channel once had, and I'm glad to see it's still doing good things. And so kudos to Jaron Whitsett, and I always forget your damn name, but you're one of the best. It'll come to me. Yeah, but I'm not a group person, as you've probably noticed. I have been asked onto the Globe Busters, and unfortunately it's never been at a good time for me, and I'm more one of those controversial people that needs to combat against an opponent if I'm going to get anything out, which is a shame, because I have a feeling if I eventually sit down and have a good discussion, we can make some big leaps and bounds on certain topics. And the biggest one, I think that's, I often hear you guys talking about when it comes to the moon. Near every one of the Globe Busters will say, don't know, next question. And I think possibly, I might be able to lend a little bit of input to the discussion. Like, I'm not saying all my explanations are 100% correct. In fact, they might not be at all correct. That's one thing. The beautiful thing about science is you propose a hypothesis and test it. And so far, my theory about the moon having been mined, the raw materials being mined from a place, for example, like the Grand Canyon, it seems as likely a place as any. It's as ridiculous as it sounds at first, it still stood the test of time. I mean, you look at the mainstream explanations for how we have a moon today, and theirs are probably more unlikely than mine. Like a giant Mars-sized object, Theia, collided with the Earth and knocked it off, created an asteroid belt, and they all collected and became a perfectly circular moon that just so happened to be the exact same size visually to us as the sun. Yeah, that's one. The one that aliens brought it in, dragged it in from another UFO from another galaxy far, far away, is probably more likely than that. But again, you have to go back to the old space narrative, and I just can't grasp that anymore. I used to be a huge believer in aliens and outer space and planets and potentially another planet somewhat like Earth somewhere out there. And for a long time now, I just don't. I genuinely believe that this physical plane may well be infinite, but it's the only physical plane. Now, there might be other artificial constructs out there, perhaps, but, again, we're talking spaceships or platforms of some sort, something physically made. And I think all physical matter comes from the Earth. So the moon is the biggest, number one, anomaly. It behaves like a light because it does create its own light, especially at night time when it glows like a lamp. So therefore, I do suggest, I've gone into great detail on my theory with that on previous, check the playlists, scroll down till you find just whiteboard playlists. I'm pretty sure it's the first one still at the top of the list, or just the one that says moon phases on flat Earth. That to me describes what I think the moon is. The craters all formed as bubbles. That's why they're all circular. Many still have the dollop in the center. They're all wide and shallow, like a bubble forming in, say, molten mud, boiling mud or whatever. You take a picture of it as it bursts, it looks exactly similar to a crater. So I think the moon is physical, and it came from the Earth. That's the only way I can see it of coming into being. Now, who did it, how, and why? That's open for speculation as well. Personally, I think it was an extremely intelligent being or beings. I think they must have had some sort of helpers, so they were probably very good at either manipulating genetics and creating very large humans, or they employed very large humans, or they were very large humans, the ones that thought up the idea in the first place. So, there are no forests on the flat Earth video was a bit of a game changer back in the day. That was something new to the flat Earth community, and I think that's what we sometimes need, is some new input, some fresh ideas. And I think my moon theories are what we really need. And as I've said, the physical moon, up as high as the sun, practically as high as the firmament, which is about 100 kilometers high, 60 miles, 60 to 70 miles, 100 kilometers, ballpark figures. That's as high as it gets. And the moon being diamagnetically repelled from the Earth is what holds it up there. And those same energies that keep everything in motion, the sun and stars, it's a time of electromagnetic force. Well, up there where there's virtually no friction, the moon has tapped into those same energies. However, because it is physical, even though it's in virtually, it's virtually weightless, because if it's full of helium, like a balloon that just hovers in the air, it'd be weightless. So even though it has weight and it has mass, by virtue of density and buoyancy equation, it is considered weightless because it's a state of almost equilibrium, and possibly the temperature is what causes it to fluctuate. So when we've got a supermoon, when it's closer, that's when it's in more dense air. Or actually, it could be the opposite. The more dense, the colder the air, the more it floats. So the moon is actually sort of slightly warm. Now, you wouldn't expect to feel heat off the moon just because it's lit by the sun, any more than you would expect to see at sunset. You can see a massive mountain in the distance, say 20 miles away, and it's still high enough to capture sunlight. Would you expect to feel heat off the mountain 20 miles away just because it's lit by the sun? So why would you the moon just because it's lit by the sun? Now, the sunlight itself, well, that's entering another tricky phase altogether, but it's the light which creates the heat, not the sun. So heat doesn't come from the sun, it comes from the sunlight interacting in the atmospheric gases that it stimulates, much like, a light bulb will get hot, but you can get some amount of warmth from the light bulb projected. Not exactly the same. Anyway, I'm trying to get to the tides. So this will come important. In fact, I forgot to bring the one little tool I was going to bring so we could do a demonstration. So bear with me. Right, I'm back. So I've got a little instrument here. This is just a long cylinder tube, formerly known as a straw, but now it's a metal because it's made of metal, not straw. You could probably make them out of just about anything. Now, as I was just describing, if a diamagnetic force is responsible for holding the moon aloft, obviously now the moon has mass and size. I've tried to estimate many times and I can't really come to a conclusion. When we see high altitude balloon footage, for example, once we go above firmament B, which is about 20 kilometres high, 12 to 14 miles I believe. Once you go above firmament B, there's no atmospheric gases, so the sky goes from blue to black. And from there, you do not see the plasma projection moon. So that's what I think in this firmament B, the actual moon is reflecting the solar energy that hits it. And from a line of sight between the viewer down on the ground looking up towards where the actual moon is, in that line of sight, a holographic plasma projection is created in firmament B, which is just gaseous, and it illuminates or ionizes, stimulates the noble gases xenon and what's the other one, krypton, and they glow with that greyish light, that grey and white, black and white light. It's a non-colour light. It doesn't have the neon or the argon, the ones that give us colour. And that's why at night time, even if you can read a book under moonlight, you cannot see colour pictures. Any images you see will be in black and white. Everything is in black and white. The only colours you'll see are artificial man-made lights, like the tail lights of a car, for example, will appear red, or street lights. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere where there's no artificial light, the whole scene is black and white. And that's moonlight's effect. So now when it comes to tides, so nobody, I don't think, has as much experience as what I have had in my lifetime. I'll be 52 shortly, in a couple of months, of the tides. At 13 years of age, I moved from the country to the coast and started learning how to surf and became a coastal lover. It was all my spare time at the beach, in the river, up the lakes. There's tidal influences everywhere, and so I came to learn this stuff. And then when I moved up to the Byron Shire, lived in Byron Bay, right on the beach for a couple of years, my lifestyle through I worked an early morning job cleaning pubs back then, and I had my days free. So I'd go down the beach, I'd have my swim in the first thing in the morning just to get cleansed, and then is it a low tide? Perfect for a beach ride. You can't ride your bike on the beach at a high tide because the sand is really soft and it's just crap. It's horrible. But on a nice low tide, the sand stretches right out, it's packed hard, and it's just the perfect place to go for a nice long bike ride. So that's pretty much how I've spent my days for years. And I had the moon chart, just exactly like that one. He puts out a new one every year. And so I just do my gardening things, grow a few plants here, some pot plants, all sorts of herbs and whatnot. And I've always gardened via the moon. So I've always got a pretty good idea what the moon is doing, what phases it's in, whether it's waxing or waning, and then I look to that to see if it's in a fertile sign. If it's in a fertile waxing sign, I won't go and mow the lawn unless I want to encourage it to grow. Say if I've planted new growth or whatever, you go and trim it then, or prune some plants you want to encourage to grow. a waxing fertile sign is the time to do it because the moon's getting fatter and fatter, and the fertility of the sign encourages growth. And then obviously after the full moon, it's waning again. That's when it's the best time in an infertile sign, because here it's semi-tropical, everything grows so well. I only like to mow my lawn once a month or less if I can get away with it. So I'd wait, I'd let it get a bit long for those couple of weeks while everybody else is out mowing their lawn, and then when the time I get out to do mine during the waning moon, they're already mowing theirs again, whereas I just do mine then, and then it's usually good for about a month. And so I've been doing this stuff for 30 odd years, man. So I know a fair bit about the tides and the moon. And one thing in particular I noticed way back when I still lived down in Hawk's Nest and Tea Gardens is that at Christmas time, people would talk about the king tides. Everything's happening at Christmas time because you get the king tides, you got the prawns running, you've got everything's happening, and of course you've got to go to the pub. And the pub sits on the riverfront at Tea Gardens, and the water, after we crossed across the Singing Bridge, watching this beautiful big fat full moon rising, the road itself would start to go slightly underwater from this king tide. So it's like, full moon, king tide, makes sense, right? Well, if you really think about it, when the moon's just rising, it's 6 hours before it's going to be overhead. In fact, the moon, the tides and the moon, the phases each day, it's 25 hours for the moon to go around us once. So it's 6.25 hours between the tide. So from the high to the low, from the low to the next high, from that high to the next low, they're all 6.25 hours, or 12.5 minutes if you want to get real specific, apart from one another. So it's 50 minutes, not an hour. So when the moon is rising, if the moon is pulling the tide, it should be the lowest tide. It shouldn't be the highest. The highest should be 6 hours later when it's overhead, or a bit beyond overhead when it's pulled all the ocean towards it. But it does the exact opposite. And this is one thing I noticed over many years of observations, watching the moon as the moon's advancing before it's full, say in the afternoon, a few days before full. The high tide is creeping up across the soft sand, and it's like, I don't know the best description for it, like quicksilver. When you've got dry sand, say if you've got a ball of flour rolling water across flour or something like that, before the flour has saturated into it, it's dry, so it rolls. Well, the sand does something similar to that. So the first fingers of the waves, as I call it, tendrils, as they're sneaking up slowly towards my towel, carrying little bits of flotsam and jetsam and sand and shells and all sorts of stuff, just rolling along like quicksilver, like mercury type of thing, across the dry sand. And then by the time that saturates into the sand, then the next one that comes up is already going to be saturated into it, so it won't do that until it hits the next bit of dry sand. So you can watch as it comes in waves, quite literally, with the moon advancing towards me. As I say, a good 6 hours before it's going to be overhead. And then at other times I have noticed when the moon is overhead, some very strange energies. You can sort of feel some sort of, I didn't know what the force was at the time, but if I was to put a name to it, I would say a diamagnetic downward repulsive force. There's just no other way to describe it. It's very, very, very subtle. Okay, it's something you'd have to be finely tuned in to even think to try and feel it. And it is very, very, very rare, mind you, as well, that the moon will actually be directly overhead of your very location. So Byron Bay, being the easternmost point of the Australian mainland, is pretty well in the centre of the circle. It's a bit south of the Tropic of Capricorn. Not too much. And because the moon is on this elliptical circuit, there will be times when we are directly beneath the moon. And I can only honestly say I've only ever felt that once in my life out of thousands and thousands and thousands of hours I've spent at the beach. There's only one time I've particularly noticed that actual sensation of being directly beneath the moon. It's kind of an eerie sort of feeling. So this is just what I want to do for my demonstration, is just prove to you that you cannot pull water. Now, if I put the straw in the water, I get a mouthful of lovely brown water. If I hold the straw just above, however, no matter how hard and forcefully I suck, and a lot of people will tell you I suck pretty bad, or suck a lot, or, you know, I've heard it all, so you can say what you like. You cannot pull water. However, just a gentle blow. I probably should adjust the camera for this. I won't be able to watch it. Just a gentle blow. You don't have to blow hard. You don't have to be a blowhard. Just gently blowing. It is very, very, very easy to repel water. And so that is why I've come upon the theory then that the very subtle force of the moon, taking 25 hours to go around us once, has a very subtle downward depressing force upon the saltwater oceans, which in turn creates the diamagnetic repulsive force which holds the moon aloft. Between that and helium and whatever the moon is composed of, whatever material. And so that downward depressive force over a very, very vast area. So let's say, ballpark figure, the moon is 30 miles wide, that its diameter, one side or the other, is 30 miles. Now, that could be a gross exaggeration, it could be under. I'm thinking it kind of works for me, you know, like the fact that we can zoom in on it, and the plasma projection that we're zooming in on is only 12 to 14 miles high. You know, it could only be a few miles wide, 6 or 7 miles wide, 30 miles, I don't know. It does cast a shadow 70 miles wide, and sometimes it's 150 miles wide. So, sorry if I jump between miles and kilometres here and there, but that's just the way it is. So, I'm saying that it creates a downward pressure beneath the moon, pushing down into the oceans, and then fluid mechanics. So it's not constantly blowing like my demonstration. That's just an example of how a downward force can easily repel water. It's driving the tides outwards, and fluid mechanics takes over and does the rest. So as it drives the tide toward the east coast, the water, naturally wanting to seek its level, is constantly fighting back against it, but it's pushing and pushing and pushing until it's reached the highest, and then it passes overhead, and then it starts repelling it back out, so the tide starts flowing back out. Now, this is only a very, again, in my experience, it's a difference in tides generally from about a half metre low tide to 1.5 to 2 metre high tide, and the king tide might only be 2.2 metres. And the major low, 0.2 metres, 200 millimetres, 2200 millimetres. It's not a huge amount of water when you think about it. It's really just a ripple, but from our perspective, living on the flat coastal areas, 2 metres of water is a lot, you know, it's head height. So it's quite significant. And the one time I went up the coast, drove to Townsville, I was told I didn't get to see it because the ocean's actually really boring up there. And not nice, but they reckon they have like 14 metres of tide just at Townsville. So, and then, you know, reading through the comments of Jaren's tidal video, which he released today being the 19th, 18th, something. It's May. Cheers. Whatever day it may be. Yeah, people say in Jamaica they barely have any tides. There's other places like, just trying to think of it, the Maldives. I believe they have no tides. And these places are near the equator. And yet, when I went to the Philippines, they had really big tides. You notice within an hour just how much the tide had come in or gone out from these different places you swim at. So it's very hard to know exactly where and what is creating the influences that determine the height of the tides. Like the other one was that Bay of Fundy, a place in Canada, Nova Scotia or somewhere, I believe, where it's quite a huge inlet and being far north. So by the time the moon passes by, it's pushing the water sideways towards the extreme north or extreme south. Whereas a place east and west coasts in sort of the centre of the ring, they're getting their tides coming quite regularly, whereas places north and south of that will be quite delayed. So somewhere like England, another good example, they won't get their high tide until the moon is actually overhead, because it's still actually far away over the equator. So it's pushed the same amount of distance north for the tide to reach there when the moon is overhead. But if you're just under the path of the moon, then when the moon is overhead, that's when you'll have the lowest of the low tides. And of course, then as it pushes the water back, the natural tendency of water is, if you've sat up in a bathtub suddenly, that you create a bit of a splash back, but then the next one going back forwards is quite often even bigger. And then when it comes back, it might even be bigger again. So in a sense, the oceans are much bigger than a bathtub, of course, but you're still getting that same fluid dynamic effect, so that when the high tide hits back towards the west coast from where the moon came, it will be the lesser high tide of the day, but it will then automatically then keep rebalancing back down, by which time the moon has come full circuit and starts driving it away again. And hence that's the only way I can think that we can have 2 high tides in the 25-hour period and 2 low tides. And the spinning spaceball model has got nothing on that. It's got nothing. When you ask them, they will say that the moon creates a tidal bulge. So it's like an egg-shaped bulge around the world in the middle. So the high tide is always facing the moon and the Earth spins through this bulge. Now, why the heck would there be a bulge on the backside away from where the moon is? Now, because the moon obviously only takes a whole month to go around us once. So as the Earth spins once every 24 hours, and the moon takes a whole month to go backwards around us from west to east, mind you, 27.3 days. Well, that's why it appears to rise 50 minutes later each day, because it's actually going away from what we think it's rising from. So if we're told gravity is the answer for all this stuff, so the gravity of Earth holds all the water to the Earth, all the oceans, 70% of the surface is oceans. So our surface is mostly water. Now, we've never seen standing bodies of water curve. That's just impossible, impractical, ridiculous, utter nonsense. But water finding its level, okay, that can do that by rising and staying flat and lowering and staying flat. Now, some people will put forth the proposition that it goes into the great deep somewhere in the north and then it gets pumped back out again. It doesn't work that way. It's the mechanics of doing that just on swimming pool size alone is huge. You could do it, expensive, but impractical and difficult. So to do it on the Earth scale twice per day, when all the tides are different everywhere at different times. So an explanation where all the tides had the one cause from water rising and lowering would have all tides everywhere occurring at the same time every day. Even if it's a different time each day, it'd be the same time everywhere each day at different times. You know what I mean? So, but if it's the moon being the timepiece, just like an hour hand, a 25-hour hour hand, moving around above us and repelling the waters away, that gives us a match with when our tides occur. It gives us a description for why they occur at different times in different places, and it works. But on the globe again, if we're saying that all of Earth's gravity is holding the oceans to it, the moon, 240,000 miles away, is pulling a high tide towards it as Earth spins through that bulge, that model only describes one major high tide on that side and a major low tide the other side the whole time. But we've got two at opposite sides, 12 and a bit hours apart from one another constantly. So that side, the back side of the Earth, has all of Earth's gravity pulling the oceans to it, and the moon's gravity on the other side of it would still make an extremely low tide if it did anything at all. It would not give a second high tide on the rear side. But the glober's explanation for this, I kid you not, this is their genuine explanation, is that the moon pulls the Earth itself through its own oceans to create a secondary bulge on the back. Now, think about that. How does that make sense at all? As I just explained, all of Earth's gravity is pulling all of the Earth's oceans towards the center anyway, in the first place. So even if the moon pulled the Earth through its own oceans, the Earth is still pulling its oceans with it, isn't it? It's still going to be pulling it towards the moon, and then the high tide towards the moon, having the Earth pulled through it, would negate that high tide anyway. So they've negated both the high tides by saying they pull the Earth through its own oceans. So the globe model is absolutely 100% broken when it comes to tides. And like any black swan, that is sufficient to destroy the entire model. It's just destroyed. You only need one. And tides and the moon even existing, is sufficient to do that. I don't even have to enter into the fact that because the Earth is orbiting the sun, that it is travelling at 66,600 miles per hour around the sun. And it's convenient how these figures work, because that works out 100,000 kilometres an hour, which means to go nearly a degree. So it's virtually a straight line of 100,000 kilometres. And the moon, if it's 240,000 miles, it'd have to be probably 333,000 kilometres, I bet. I bet it works out at that. It'd have to be. Let's just say 330,000 kilometres away. And if it's gently wafting around us once every 27.3 days, at least we don't have metric or imperial days, they're all 24 hours in a day, it means that the moon is also moving that 100,000 kilometre an hour trajectory. So that's like 2,400,000 kilometres a day, while the moon is just wafting around at 3,000 kilometres an hour, 330,000 kilometres away. That's 240,000 miles. The speeds that it would have to be going, and yet, to our observations, to all our experiences, the Earth isn't moving at all. The moon gently wafts around above us. I mean, when you zoom in on it with a powerful zoom camera, it actually seems to be moving quite fast. And in fact, if you do sit and watch a moon rise, it's moving at a fair rate of knots. It's not actually standing still, but it still, to all appearances, just seems to be wafting gently overhead to the point where it takes from a high tide to a low tide 6.25 hours. And then from that low tide to the next high, another 6.25 hours, and so on and so forth. So it's a 25-hour cycle of the moon gently wafting around us, whereas the sun is exactly 24 hours. And that answers tides on the stationary plane of Earth and debunks the globe, because the globe has no answer for tides. Just none. Let alone pressurised atmosphere flying through a vacuum and all the rest of that crap. Anyway, join me next time. I'm going to debunk Coriolis effect. Cheers. Thanks for watching.